The first thing I wanted to just thank Stanford and Jay and the Brown Institute and everyone else who has anything to do with putting this this conference on. It's really useful and it's really very different than any other out there. I also wanted to thank the Tao Center at Columbia University, which has been funding some of the work that went into this talk today, where I've been working on how we can apply data sciences to investigative and accountability reporting in particular. So the first thing I just wanted to do was to just, again, it's kind of like Peter's poll from earlier, just get a sense of how many people here have ever reported an investigative story before that you think of as investigative, or been supervising one. Okay, so it looks like about an eighth of the people here. And one of the reasons I want to check that is because a lot of times we have a lot of problems in both the data journalism field, and my guess is in a lot of the part of data sciences, that we don't really know what we're talking about when we talk about either one. So investigative reporting doesn't really have a great definition. Data science doesn't have a great definition. So I wanted to start out just thinking about that. And to talk a little bit then about how reporters, particularly in the past, have integrated advances in other fields into our needs. How have we twisted the worlds of social science, for instance, into the needs of journalists? And what can we learn from and adapt from other disciplines and other trades, and then what opportunities and roadblocks exist for the future. So that's kind of the outline of where we're going to go. So the first thing is, what is data science? I'll use Drew Conway's Venn diagram, and he talks about it as the intersection of math and statistics with substantive expertise and hacking skills. And the place that reporters and journalists have generally fallen is right in what he calls the danger zone, which is where we know just enough about something of substance and just enough about hacking and nothing about math and statistics. So we're going to come back to the idea of whether that's really such a danger zone for the purposes of journalism. I'm not sure it is, but it's a worthwhile thing to think of when we start looking at how reporters can start using data science. So then there's the next problem, which is what is a definition of investigative reporting? I do sit on the board of IRE, so I can use the contest of IRE as an example of a definition, which is to make something public of importance that somebody or something wants to keep secret. That's one definition. It's a little narrow, but it's the definition that IRE uses. Another one can be adapted from Len Downey Jr., who was the executive editor for the Washington Post for many years and the author in the 1970s of a book called The New Muckrakers, which is why this is called the newest Muckrakers. And he talks a lot about holding institutions and powerful people accountable to those they serve. And that really investigative, or what he calls accountability reporting, can be considered anything that falls into that genre. And there's a long history of this. One of the first stories, right after the founding of the Union, Benjamin Franklin Bash, the nephew of Benjamin Franklin, was leaked a congressional document that showed that George Washington had paid himself $4,000 more than Congress had allocated for his salary. And at the time, that was about a quarter of his salary. So he was overpaying himself, and it came from leaked documents, and that was one of the techniques that we have always used. I want to get a little bit into kind of how journalists, though, have integrated other fields as those fields have developed. And I think there's a really interesting intersection of methods in the mid-1800s when in 1855, I believe it was John Snow's famous cholera map, which showed that cholera was focused around the Broad Street pump in the Soho neighborhood of London, and kind of debunked a lot of myths about where that disease came from. A few years later, Frank Leslie, in Frank Leslie's Illustrated, followed horse-drawn wagons out of 16th Street stalls in New York City, and this anecdote is well documented in Jay Hamilton's new book on the Democracy's Detectives. But the story was that they were getting milk from sick and dying cows and then slapping a sign on the back of the wagon that said Westchester County, and then delivering this poisoned milk all over New York City. And those two methods of looking for where disease was coming from were pretty similar across John Snow and across Frank Leslie. And at the time, the only way that reporters really had a way to get at stories was direct observation. So when Nellie Bly wanted to look at the treatment of insane people in New York City, she had to act as an insane person and get herself admitted into the asylum and produce the story 10 Days in an Asylum. So those methods stayed pretty much the same for reporters until about the 1960s. And the great thing about the 1960s was we got the copy machine. And for reporters, this was the be-all, end-all, right? It meant that no longer did somebody have to steal a document in order to give it to you, that they could actually make a copy, and we could move from direct observation to the examination of artifacts of government, things that already existed inside government agencies, which was a huge breakthrough. The next real breakthrough came, as many of you guys I'm sure are expecting, from Phil Meyer, who in 1968 decided during a riot in Detroit that he had recently read about trends and reasons for discontent among Black Americans that some professors, I believe they were at Stanford, but I'm not sure, it might have been UCLA, had been studying, and it took them 3 years to do a survey of Black Americans to find out what problems were in that community. He decided during the riots to do that same survey in 3 weeks. And at the time, what he called it was social science in a hurry. And he started using the methods of survey research to journalistic questions. And that led to the publication of what he called precision journalism, which was the melding of narratives with social science methods in order to get stories that people wanted to read that were also important. He continued that work through the 70s, and so the same year as Watergate, Jim Bartlett and Don Steele did a series for the Philadelphia Inquirer called Crime and Injustice, where Phil helped them do a survey of court records in Philadelphia showing that Blacks were given tougher sentences than whites when you accounted for everything else. We continued to borrow from other fields. The next one was from business when Elliot Jaspin discovered spreadsheets and what at the time was relatively new structured query language. And he began teaching reporters all over the country how to use what he called 9-track express, the ability to get information off of 9-track tapes and into the hands of journalists. But instead of using structured query language to, for instance, maintain bank records, what he wanted to use it for was to match two databases against each other so that he could find famously bus drivers who also had drunk driving records, or politicians who were getting breaks on their tax returns, on their property taxes. And one of the issues there was that he was able to start training reporters all around the country to use these new tools in a way that no one had ever intended them to be used in the first place. So that was kind of the idea that when we got the training, when we got the methods, when we got the ideas, we could actually adapt to this pretty quickly. So that pattern of borrowing from other fields has been true in investigative reporting almost since its inception. And so now we're at this kind of inflection point where I was at Duke University for 3 years between 2009 and 2012. And I was shocked to discover when I got back to the newsroom in 2012, and I believe it's still true now, that every single thing in the media business has changed over those 3 years except for reporting. And we're still using the methods of reporting in a newsroom right now, pretty much unchanged since the advent of the public internet in about 1995. That we have failed to integrate a lot of the new techniques and a lot of the new technologies into everyday reporting as well as investigative reporting the way that we had integrated them before. And I'm not arguing maybe we shouldn't, because journalism rarely invents new methods. We usually apply the ones that other people have figured out and perfected. So we're now at a point, though, where we should be doing that. So how can we learn from other fields? Well, one way to do that is to look inside ourselves and start looking to see, do we have people in our own newsrooms, in our own buildings who can help us? Back in the old days, when we were learning how to use spreadsheets and databases, we used to wait for the circulation department to go home, and then we'd hop over the wall that separated news from business at the time. And we would use their computers to be able, because we didn't have any computers in the newsroom, we would use their computers so that we could get the work done. And so is there another wall we can hop over today to get to the data scientists? And at the New York Times, we may have, I don't know, 6 or 7 very distinct data groups. Some are data journalism groups, some are not. One of them used to be called our machine learning group, which is run by Chris Wiggins, formerly of Columbia University. I guess he's still there. But we have a whole bunch of these data groups that are working on audience development, on how to distribute our information better, on how to display it better, on how to present information better in infographics and in other ways. But we don't really have, my little tiny team is the only one that's really involved in news gathering in a new way, as opposed to news distribution in a new way. So we've had some success in doing that. As an example, I had a fairly simple question that I was working on about a year or two ago when I was working on a story on a survey of police, about 800 police departments. And the Justice Department had surveyed these police departments, and we wanted to find out more about them. And they had taken that survey from a census of police departments nationwide. They had very kindly removed the unique identifier that identified that information from that census, and then very kindly again changed a lot of the names. And so they didn't match. So I knew where the list of police departments came from. I knew how I could get demographics about those areas if I could get back to the geography. I couldn't get back to the geography until I could match those two lists together. And one of our machine learning experts happened to be walking by. I said, well, how would you do this? And that's one way we can learn, right? It's just somebody walking by telling us how they would do it. And she came up with a very simple classifier, simple machine learning classifier, that matched the two lists pretty well. The problem is that what we learned later is, as most of you all who are in computation, choosing the features is a lot more important than how exactly you decide to train a classifier. And what we had left out was the state that the police department was in. So that Jefferson County Sheriff's Office in California was matched to Jefferson County Sheriff's Office in Missouri or whatever. So that didn't work so well, but we learned a lot from it, and we learned a lot about how do we choose some features that would be a little bit better. The same thing happened with county versus city. We didn't choose those as separate features. So another way that we can learn is to see what other fields are doing. And in some ways, the humanities and social sciences seem like the best fit for that. There's an example is the history lab at Columbia University. Matthew Connolly has said that he was set out to look into how he could explore document collections, one of them being Hillary Clinton's emails. And what he wanted was to create more of he didn't want any more what he called flashlights. Instead, what he wanted was the equivalent of what he called infrared lenses, radiation detectors, and autonomous drones to look into this data set. And they were able to pretty much get to a good start on what they wanted to do there, but he said he learned a lot about machine learning and data science when he was doing this project. And one of those things that he learned was that the same thing that we run into journalism. He wasn't willing to have this be 80% right or 90% right. He needed it 100% right. And that there was some tension in that world between those two things. And that happens a lot in the humanities and the social sciences. Similarly, a group of social scientists and computationalists at the University of Washington, led by John Wilkerson, tried another kind of technique from the computer sciences to say, can we set up a contest for social sciences using machine learning and natural language processing and really any text as data method? Can we set up a contest the way they have in computer sciences to see what happens when we set people loose on a data set? And the data set that they set people loose on was the Open Market Committee meeting transcripts from just before and during the financial crisis in the Federal Reserve. And what he has said was that he was also a little bit disappointed in this experiment. And what he told me was that he'd learned an important distinction between disciplines and computer scientists. And the way he put it is that computer scientists has hammers and they're all looking for nails. Political scientists have substantive areas of interest. And frankly, anyone who was interested in the Open Market Committee meeting transcripts from 2006 to 2011 or whatever it was, had already read them all. And so the bar for entry, for learning something new, was very high. And that also happens in journalism, is that everything we do on a computational front has to produce more quickly than it would if we just called people up. And one of the definitions of a great reporter that I've always thought of is somebody who gets other people to do your work for free. That's how we define a great reporter. So we have to be able to do better than that in any kind of computational method. And another example from the political sciences, Justin Grimmer, who's here at Stanford, has written that, that in political science, their goal is rarely descriptive. It's more inferential and causal. And that computational methods really don't help that much in that kind of area. But he has argued that because political scientists have an expertise in measurement, that they can apply these methods in a way that other people can't. And I think he's probably right about that. He uses them to describe characteristics rather than predict outcomes the way that a computer scientist would. And I think it's an interesting way of thinking about it. And the last example from the sciences that I'd like to think about are sociologists, who also look at text as data. And a lot of times what they're often doing is something like the idea of plagiarism detection or search technologies or other methods that have been frequently used in industry that they can apply to their work. So we often face some of the same challenges that these other groups face when they're trying to apply computational methods. We need to be 100% correct in our reporting, not 95%. We do face libel issues, and we'd rather be right. You know, it's kind of a good thing to be in journalism. And the other thing that we are also have in common with these groups is that asking the right question is usually a whole lot harder than getting an answer to it. And so our methods of getting at an answer are pretty simple once we've been able to ask the right question. So we looked at a couple ways that reporters might borrow from the other sciences and disciplines, but I want to kind of think about them more in terms of stories that we've worked on and walk through some stories where computational methods have helped or might have helped. And the ways in which they might have helped are a little bit different than what I think, at least that I thought they would have been going into them. First thing is just kind of keep an eye on what kind of sources might be used in any given story. They're often redacted documents. They're often recordings of legislative proceedings. They're whispers across the, across a secure phone. They're scraping the web. They're locked up in PDFs or in archives or on handwritten forms. So the sources of investigative reporting now are much less direct observation now than they are artifacts, examining historical or administrative artifacts. I want to give an example. One issue then in some of these is how do we get something of meaning from images? And I don't think that most reporters would think of that as a problem for us, but it really is. One is an obvious one. Amanda Cox, who now runs the Upshot, was at the time one of our graphics reporters at the Times, and we were working on a story on stolen art in China. And one of the questions was whether or not there was forgery going on in the art markets in China. It's a little bit more complicated than that because of it's kind of like the Andy Warhol factories are more common there, so it's not quite as obvious as it looks. But one of the things that we wanted to do was to scrape the website of the main auction in China and see how many of the same paintings were sold over and over and over again. And so I think there were about 40,000 sales that she was able to scrape, and she used a machine learning algorithm to find all of Kibashi's shrimp and to look at them to see how likely they were to be the same thing. And I think she found that there were about 30 or 40 that looked almost precisely the same. And so that would be one idea. How do we do some image recognition and some image comparisons? It'd be very useful to be able to take pictures of events and figure out who was at them from the pictures. There are a whole lot of image issues that we would like to be able to use that for. But even more commonly is handwriting recognition, which is still really in its infancy, I think, and it still doesn't work that well, but there is so much that we still get that's handwritten. You'd be really surprised. One example that was really fun was when I was at Duke. I just did this as an experiment, wasn't for publication. Mark Benjamin, then of Salon, was working on a lot of stories on Arlington Cemetery. And what he had was the list that's on the left, upper left there, which was a list of everyone who was supposed to be buried in Arlington Cemetery. The problem was it was alphabetical, and it wasn't by location in the cemetery. So he was having a hard time figuring out, how am I going to walk the cemetery to see if the people who are supposed to be there are there, or the graves that are supposed to be there are there. And so I looked at one of the really common plugins to Python for handwriting recognition, and it worked really well on this one thing. And if you look at it, the handwriting is perfect. It's exactly the same every time, the way that the handwriting was back in the 1800s and early 1900s. And so I could pretty much get his list into order by gravesite rather than by name by doing that. But that's just one example. We get handwritten police reports still. We still get all kinds of handwritten notes from public records requests. And being able to do something with that handwriting would be really useful. And then the other image issue is that I think Bellingcat is doing some really interesting work on this before the report came out yesterday or the day before on the Russian involvement in the plane and shooting down the plane. Bellingcat did some crowdsourcing work and followed some of the tanks and some of the equipment that was being brought into Ukraine, and was able to show that the very same trucks were there, once with 4 missiles and then later on with 3 or something. I think that's what it was. So it's an interesting way to think about how we can start using some machine learning methods on images, more and more that we can get off of YouTube that is still kind of hidden there, that we might be able to do some investigations off of. Another kind of common problem in investigative reporting is not so much finding a single fact, but in documenting a pattern. And in this story from Reuters, the echo chamber, which was a Pulitzer finalist 2 years ago, one of the things that they were interested in was how do you figure out whose cases are not making it to the Supreme Court? Is there some kind of bias in the cases that are making it to the Supreme Court? And that was an example when someone had suggested to them that they use machine learning to try to do topic models of the cases that were rejected by the Supreme Court. Reuters owns Westlaw, so they have an awful lot of legal resources available to them. If you talk to Janet Robinson, who led that project, she'll tell you that she's not entirely sure that the topic modeling really helped all that much. And I think that one problem with it is that, again, this issue that they wanted to put one and only one topic on each case, which probably was going to be hard to do, but that it had to be 100% correct, and it had to have a lot of meaning. And so trying to figure out a good topic model that would help them with that wasn't obvious. I wonder in retrospect if you might have been able to do this in reverse. And I'll give another couple of examples of where that might happen backwards. Is that instead of trying to use the topic model to set the categories, if they had used it to check the categories that hand coders had made and say, do these things really look the same to a computer the way that they looked the same to a person? And I think this goes back to something that John Wilkerson told me, is that on these small scale projects, the 10,000 to 40,000 record projects, it's gonna be hard to beat human categorization. That it's just too small for a lot of the machine learning techniques, but it's too big for something that's efficient for one person. And we're often stuck in that kind of middle range of scale that doesn't have a great efficient solution right now. But I think we can use classification, topic modeling, and things like it to check our work later on. I have another example of that. Last year, we had spreadsheets from the Border Patrol of about 23,000 complaints that had been registered over a period of about 4 or 5 years. And they had very, very short descriptions of the complaints against the agents. And they were really like, I think that they had to fit in the 255 character field or something like that. It was pretty much 2 tweets worth. And we went ahead and categorized them by using pretty simple keyword searching and things like it. And again, the same person walked by, Erica Green, who's one of our machine learning experts, walked by one day and said, so what are you doing? And I showed her, and she said, well, let's try it. Let's try a classification model on this. And what we learned was that our hand coding that was replicated by a machine really well, like better than 95% of the time in 5 out of 7 categories. And it utterly failed in the other 2. It completely failed. It was like 40% accurate in the other 2. And when we went back and looked at it, we realized that we were being pretty arbitrary about where we were putting things in different types of discipline. We were categorizing different kinds of discipline, like were you late for work? Did you lose your equipment? Did you treat a prisoner badly? And really, there just wasn't enough information in those short descriptions to make a good distinction between those 2 categories, types of discipline against an officer. So I think that some of the ways that we can start thinking about how do we adapt our work, how do we adapt some methods from computation into our work is more as a validation. One of the things that happens in journalism is it is extremely rare, unlike in social sciences, that we have more than one person doing our reading and categorizing. It's almost always one person usually like stuck at home for 2 days with a lot of tea and a hot fire, and if it were California or Oregon or Colorado, maybe a little bit of pot, I don't know, but just it's so mind-numbingly dull that you just sit at home and you read these documents and you classify them. But only one person does it. I know of very few cases where we've worked on cross-validation of our own classification. And this is one way that we might be able to use some of that efficiency. I've been talking, Jay mentioned the story that Rob Gebeloff from my team worked on this year with Jessica Silva Greenberg on arbitration. And we've been talking lately about like how he did that story, because one of the things that he did was to download, I think it was about 3,000 lawsuits from, again, from Westlaw and then from Pacer, and read through them to figure out whether or not they were ones that were kicked out of court because of arbitration clauses. And he had to read through all of them, and we've been talking a little bit about how might he have adapted other methods to help him figure that out more efficiently. The other thing that we often, we don't have as much as people think we have, I think, is repetitive data. One of the challenges in investigative reporting is we generally get one data set once, we throw it out, and we never come back to it again. That also makes a well-tuned model not very useful for us over time. But there are some exceptions to that. One of them, for instance, is campaign finance, which a lot of newsrooms keep on hand, because rarely does a campaign finance data set actually get you a story, but it becomes a backdrop for a lot of stories. Political influence is not that easily documented, but once you have documented other patterns, the political influence is worthwhile to look into. And that's one area where people have done some modeling and have done some pretty successful modeling. Chase Davis, now of the Times, has done a lot of work on defining donor clusters, and basically what he's doing with that is trying to disambiguate names in campaign finance records. And so now, you know, every month when the campaign finance data comes in, we run his program, which he calls Lincoln, against it, and we have pretty well disambiguated people very much quicker than we would have by hand. So that's another example of where it happens. A really good example of that happened at the LA Times when they worked for a long time on a story on downgrading crime. And they got all of the police reports from, I believe it was from a short period of time from LAPD. And they were able to document how often LAPD was downgrading crimes. For instance, were they calling what should be an assault a simple assault, or were they calling what should have been a sexual assault, a simple assault, something like it. And they never thought, they published the story, they were done, they never thought anything else would come of it. And then all of a sudden LAPD dumped on them another 5 years of data. And they were really interested in, oh my gosh, I wonder if 5 other years would change the story, right? I mean, I wonder if this has been true over time, if it's changed. And that was when they found, because they had done all of that work by hand already once for one story, they were able to leverage it for another. So those are some of the advantages. The last one I just want to mention is getting a kind of a high-level description of a collection of documents. And that's something that's pretty common across the humanities also, that it's, for instance, I don't know, I can't show you the interface of what the Panama Papers looked like when we were working, when we got access to them, but I will tell you that the only analysis, quote unquote, that could be done on anything was what could be scraped in a structured format out of HTML pages. Virtually all of the collection was buried in OCR documents, often handwritten, and that were kind of within folders, within folders, within folders. Even some of the metadata might have been useful to be able to get some kind of a high level. So it would have been nice to be able to say, like, what names are common across all of these? Just simple stuff like entity recognition. Maybe that would have been a place for topic modeling if the OCR was good enough. The OCR was pretty bad, but it wasn't their fault. It just was, they were difficult documents to OCR. So that's kind of the last place where I think that probably we'll be able to implement that pretty quickly. I don't think that that's really that much of an issue. So the question is, why aren't we doing this already at scale? Why are reporting, this is all very, for those of you who are in the computational world, the things I'm describing are things that were novel 20 years ago, 15 years ago, something like it. We're not talking about great new advances in computation here. We're talking about pretty straightforward things. Why aren't they more common in newsrooms? And I think the first one has to do with that Venn diagram, that reporters really do believe that they're in a danger zone and that they better not do these kinds of things because we're going to make a mistake. And so one of the things is that what we're missing still, and that's part of what the TAO project that I'm working on is, and I know that there are other people working on it as well, is that we couldn't use structured query language until Elliot Jaspin and later the National Institute for Computer Assisted Reporting was able to show reporters how it would work on live stories that they cared about. How do I get to a story? One of the last things reporters are interested in is doing a study. And so and they are very impatient with, for instance, trying to learn how to use, I don't know, at the time, Microsoft Access by building a personnel system for a business or something. That's just not something that they care about. Or they don't want to learn Excel by showing how do you present a sales report to your boss. So until we had materials that were focused on what kinds of stories can you do, it's really hard for reporters to kind of open our imagination to that. And I know he's here, David Bamman from Berkeley, who's an expert in natural language processing, came to talk with us last week at the Times, and we've been talking about how do we set up some training for reporters where we can start using some of these methods. And he's been teaching to social scientists and humanities students. And so I was talking with him about how I think we can probably borrow a lot even just from his syllabus. This is something that's more important than it sounds. I have a feeling this is why, to me, this is why network analysis never took off in newsrooms, is we were trying to use it for the wrong thing. And we were trying to use it to prove, I don't know, terrorist cells, I don't know, or trying to, you know, in my case, I had to do the network of George W. Bush's Pioneers and Rangers, his fundraisers in 2004. And it was so useless to use network analysis for this, because by the time you had collected the data set, you knew everything about it that you cared about. So I knew all of his Pioneers and Rangers intimately by the time I had finished typing them all into my data set. I really didn't need a network diagram to tell me anything. But we've started using it more for stories that you wouldn't expect it in. In the case in the upper left, for instance, we did a story a couple of years ago after the Newtown massacres. We were looking at how can we learn about gun sales through the internet. And this story was one where Griff Palmer of my team scraped a site called Arms List for 3 months. And on each Arms List ad, there's a button you can press that says, show me ads by this seller. There was no unique identifier for the seller. All we knew was that this ad was somehow connected with this ad. And we did that over a period of 3 months, and here's one of the connected components from the network that produced. So we wouldn't think of that as a network problem, but it really did help us find big sellers who really should have been licensed. As an aside, the better part of the story was the buyers who weren't supposed to be buying, which was great fun interviewing when you call somebody up and say, I see you had an ad on Arms List that you're trying to buy a gun. Our search shows that you have a conviction for whatever, assault. A felony is like, that wasn't me, that was my brother. I'm a felon, I can't have a gun. So that was one thing. Another story that we worked on it for was on the upper left, my left, your right. That is a story on Medicare billing practices, where what we did was compare the distribution of procedures across different, within one specialty, and there were some interesting patterns. All the ones in purple were clients, as we reported it out, were clients of one consulting firm that was showing this specialty's doctors how to maximize money out of Medicare. And then the ones with the little tiny dots, because they're sized by the amount of money, it's hard for you to see. The tiny little dots that made up the green blob are all the people who worked in hospitals. So we didn't do this study. This happens a lot in newsrooms. We got this far. We did about half the reporting. The reporter who I was working with got a new job. She didn't really care about it anymore, so we never finished the story. So now I can neither talk about the story, because she might want to go back to it someday, but I can't show you a story either. And we even did this a little bit even a long time ago. This was after 9/11 on the bottom, where we found one network of schools that accounted for 2% of all student visas in the United States. Was a network of 21 language schools that shared the same CEOs and officials, and also none of which had an actual classroom or students. So those are examples of kinds of why we never got really. We don't think in terms of network analysis because we've always tried to use it for the wrong questions. And I'm hoping that as we learn to use other types of computation, we'll start using it for journalistic questions, not academic questions. And so a really good example of that, I think, is at the Atlanta Constitution, and I know Sean's going to be talking about this tomorrow. They've done this remarkable series this year on sexual assault by physicians. And Jeff, and I'm going to totally ruin the pronunciation of his name, Ernthausen. I talked with him a little bit about how he used logistic regression. They had scraped about 100,000 complaints, 100,000 disciplinary actions from all the 50 states' physician boards. And one of the questions was, how many of these are about sexual assault by doctors? And the other question is, how many of these 100,000 do I actually have to read in order to know how many are about doctors? And what he used logistic regression in this case was to put a fence around the amount of work that they had to do. And Sean, you'll correct me if I misunderstood any of this. But that instead of saying, well, you have to read all 100,000, if you're willing to live with us missing some, a few, not many, but we will read everything that's in the least bit questionable, and we'll put aside the ones that have a very, very low probability of being a sexual assault. If you don't mind that there's one or two buried in there that we might have missed, here's the amount of work that we're setting ourselves up for. And so they did the hand coding themselves, but they were able to use effectively a classification system to help them put a fence around how much work they actually had to do, which was a really imaginative use of it. I think that if there's one place where you can see these kinds of methods being used really efficiently, it is at HAC with Jeff, and he's really remarkable. So the, oops, that was it. The last thing I wanted to mention on this is that one of the things that we as reporters have to get over is the idea that machine learning and some of these techniques produce predictions. And the reason is because we are not going to put predictions into the news. We're just not going to do it. We don't care about predictions. We care about describing the world as it exists. And that's why sometimes when we deal with people who are working, for instance, in my own newsroom, machine learning is usually used as a way to predict whether somebody's going to unsubscribe or not. And so that's actionable information, and often that's what data scientists talk about when they want to be able to predict activity. But the problem is that as I talk with experts about this, what I keep coming back to, which I think is so quaint, is that I'll hear experts who have never heard the term computer-assisted reporting say, you know, computers can't really do the reporting, but they can really assist you. And so I think we're back to the world of computer-assisted reporting, coming full circle 30 years later. And so maybe we cannot get away from the word data journalism, but that's another thing. But it's one of the things that we can do is use predictions to predict what we might be interested in. And I'm not convinced that that's a danger zone, that we have to really understand all of the math and statistics in order to predict what we might be interested in and what we might not be interested in, or to predict whether this name is the same as that name, since we're going to check it anyway. So if what we can start using is these tools in a way that fit in with our own kind of, our own culture, our own standards, and also our own needs, I think we can get over the words prediction. When you talk to reporters and say, well, this can predict something for you, they're like, oh, fine, go have fun with your predictions. You know, I'm not really very interested in. So the last thing that I think, though, is the biggest obstacle is our lack, as a collective group, reporters, lack of understanding of what's possible. And it's conferences like this that will help us get beyond that. You know, some of it is exposing ourselves to people who are willing, and many of the people in this room are the people who are willing to look over our shoulders and say, you know, there's another way to get at this. And so it's been really useful for conferences like this, and all I can say is thank you to the folks who want to do that. So that's all I had for now, but I'd love to open it up for a conversation.
How do you advise newsrooms who may not have a ton of resources for bringing in outside educators to try to get whatever interested journalists up to speed with stats or programming or ML?
Well, my experience in terms of getting reporters interested is to have a story. And I've never met a reporter who's just going to learn for the sake of learning, really. I mean, it just doesn't happen, you know. It's like, I've got a story, I want to get there, can you show me a better way? And that's, working story by story is what gets it. It's really interesting in our newsroom. This is another thing that happened 30 years ago that's happening again. A lot of our news departments, because the newspaper is now being produced differently, it's not as important to have a news section like Metro or National. So we're starting to reorganize around topics. And the new education pod came to me about 2 or 3 weeks ago and said, you know what, it's very clear we're going to have to learn more about data pretty soon. So can you design a training program for basic data literacy and data, basically spreadsheets for the education team? So we did that. So having a story or a mission from the top down is really the one thing that's going to happen. But also showing people how they can save time. This is one of the reasons I really think that when I'm producing these things for Tao, I'm really going to be focused on how can we save time. That's going to be a really important thing. Or how can you get to something that you never thought you could get to? If matching Hillary Clinton's emails against Clinton Foundation donors is easy to try and could pay off versus is impossible to try and is unlikely to pay off, then what we've got are opportunities rather than difficulties. And so what I'm trying to do is figure out how do we make it easier to try things that are going to fail so that we don't ever miss an opportunity on the off chance it will succeed.
Can you tell us a little bit about, have you seen many applications of data science to either reader comments or user-generated content, or that piece after the article is published and then it goes out to the world and all those people. Have you seen any products or anything that harnesses that power
I know, for
productively?
instance, in our newsroom, it's very recent, I think there was just a story on it in the Neiman Lab, and sadly, that's as close as I know about it, is what I've read about it. I don't know much about it firsthand. But, and like in our newsroom, we've always done hand-curated comments, and so now what they've done is do a machine learning algorithm to predict whether or not they would have passed our hand-curated thing. So I know that there is a lot of work around comments, I know, in academia, because they're easy to get, and so academia tends to have, like especially in graduate schools, they tend to have a lot of exercises around easy to get data. And so I know there's been a lot of work around comments. David, you've done some too, right?
Yeah, so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about where you see prediction fitting into sort of the data and computational journalism workflow. Like I know, the New York Times as well as 538 is doing election predictions, but yeah, I've also seen models, interactive models that are kind of making predictions and are telling stories through those predictions. I wonder if you could just maybe elaborate on just kind of the role of prediction, where it might fit, where it might be useful, where we might want to stay away from it.
Well, I guess I was thinking much more in the context of investigative reporting, where we're trying to either document something that is happening that shouldn't be happening, or we're trying to talk about the extent of a pattern. And so I don't see a whole lot of it there other than to tell us, here, maybe go look over in that corner. But I don't have much of an insight into places like the Upshot and 538 and what their kind of future looks like. I do know from a hiring perspective, like the Upshot, I know Amanda has been very interested in hiring subject matter experts as opposed to less journalistic, kind of the basic science writer or the basic social science writer. A person who writes about social science, much more interested in hiring in contracting and hiring with actual subject matter experts. So I wouldn't doubt that there's more prediction in that line, but I don't know. I don't have any real insight into it.
Hi, thanks for the great talk. So you mentioned on this in the last bit with the AJC investigation where someone used a tool where they used prediction or machine learning to sort of scope out the task and to direct people to look at only the examples that were kind of likely to be suspicious, likely
Or
to be
at least
case
not completely unlikely, right? Yeah.
How often is such a system used? Are there tools for it? Because I come from the technical side in machine learning where that kind of approach is now becoming kind of commonplace. There's a lot of HCI work also in integrating machine learning into very reactive and adaptive prediction frameworks to quickly go through labeling data, basically.
I can tell you it is novel enough that this is the only example I can think of where it's actually been, where at least people have talked about it being used. I was really impressed with it when I read about it and when I talked with Jeff about it, and I can tell you we'll be doing a lot more of that at the Times. But there really aren't tools, mainly because the people who would be doing this, the people who would use a tool, and also I got to back up because what you guys mean as a tool and what a reporter means as a tool are two very different things, right? So when we say tool, we mean like press that button, right? When you say tool, you mean a well-tuned algorithm, I believe. And so if we're talking about tool in your world, I think it goes back to this idea that asking the right question is a lot harder than finding the right tool to work with. So, we're happy to work with the standard stuff that comes in scikit-learn or whatever. They're just not hard enough. We do have some computational expense issues on some of the larger scale stuff, though. That, just doing something where I did, I think I did noun phrases off of, I think I was trying to extract noun phrases from only about 5,000 documents. And it took my second computer running 4 days to do that, just to get that. So we don't have kind of the huge machines that you guys have available to us. And also, we don't do a lot of work to optimize because we're going to do it once and then never again. So we should probably do more on optimization.
I'd be happy to talk to you about offline to see if,
Okay.
how to speed that up, because I might know.
Great.
Thanks.
Can
Yeah,
you
yeah.
talk about the role of structured data in your area, in particular data sets that might be useful across stories that you either have or want or think should be generally available?
Yeah, I mean, there are kind of these background databases that are used in most newsrooms pretty frequently. One is obviously Census and American Community Survey. Another is campaign finance records. Weather records come up a lot. There are some kind of standard things across newsrooms that you kind of want to have on hand. But mostly in investigative reporting, what we're doing is getting records for the first time that nobody else has ever looked at. And so that tends to be, or collecting them in a way that nobody's ever collected them, like the sexual assault, like the doctor disciplinary records. So generally, if somebody else has already done it, we have considerably less interest in it. So, but there are some of these
So
background
are
data
you
sets.
seeing a trend towards sharing across newsrooms in this regard?
I think there is some sharing. If it's, I know of a lot of people who kind of feel like it shouldn't be competitive to get a basic data set. It's what you do with it that matters. But I also know those same people, if they were the only ones with it, they would not share it, and I would not share it. So a lot of people are one of the things reporters are extremely willing to do is once they've fought a public records battle and they're done with the records, they're happy to give them away. And unlike academics, there are no issues with human subject testing. We make no promises that there will be no personally identifiable information. Our whole world is identifiable, and we try very hard to never get records to where we can't make people's names public. So, so we're willing to share them. But I think that when we talked about the reproducible research part, I think there is a general reluctance to say, I'm going to put everybody's name up there forever for somebody to go play around with. Here's an example, was in Wisconsin. They got every email that was sent to the governor during the thing with the unions in Wisconsin. There was an issue with the unions, and so he got all these emails, and they got them all. And they were very reluctant to just post that data set to the internet for anybody to look at, because every single person's email and name was on those emails. And they just didn't think, like, is it really my job to put them out there when all they did was write a letter to the governor? So, and we don't want to not have it as a public record, but they also didn't have the wherewithal to redact them. So, they just would only give it to people on the agreement, one by one. So there is some sharing, but I think there is also we do a lot with personally identifiable information. I think that we're reluctant to flaunt that with people and to say, like, I'm going to publish it because I can. And so that's where some of that will be backed off, I think. Hey, Arfan.
Sarah, thanks for the update on a lot of
Thanks.
different types of things. And I think one thing that at least when this community got created, computation and journalism, one of the attempts was to create bridges between these two. And again, you kind of laid out many different instances of what's different in a newsroom versus what's different in, at least in the computation world. I just want to get a prediction, not to use the word overloaded word here, is there any hope? Because when you make statements like, they're going to learn it because they need to solve a problem, they want to throw something away. I think the paradigm that you had once expressed, news stories are like a marathon. You run it for about so long, and what you learn is running to learn, not anything else within it. So I really want to get a sense, is there any hope where we're going to actually start kind of making progress where, it's not going to be somebody do this for me for free? Because nothing is for free.
I think there is. I would say there's been more progress than you see.
Well, I want you to say it because you kind of painted it a little bit more
No, I think there
negatively.
has been a lot of progress. The fact that we have half a dozen people inside newsrooms in the country now who are routinely looking to apply computational methods that are more sophisticated than a linear regression, or social science methods that are more sophisticated than a linear regression for good purposes. The fact that we have a half dozen newsrooms in the country where that's routinely happening is a big deal. But the other thing that's changed, I think, is there's a lot more of the trade that is in universities like here at Stanford, where they're bringing into the academic world the problems of the trade. And that has not always been the case historically in journalism programs. Journalism programs, until maybe 10, 15 years ago, were kind of like, I don't know, they weren't leading edge. They often had people who had not been in a newsroom in 20 years. And were generally hiring professors because they were good columnists or something, like really smart opinion writers or smart observers of society. And you see a lot more in universities now of cross-pollination, and also of universities that are publishing the work that comes from that. So I think there's a lot of hope. But I don't know that it's going to be the kind of hope that some people have, where they would like to see journalism become more like academia. I don't think that that's
No,
going to
I don't
happen.
think anybody's claiming that. And the question really comes down to is that there is, of course, the newsroom, which of course is in the business of getting information out to citizens that are relevant to them. But then there might be some other types of entities that might exist that actually is trying to do what Krishna just mentioned, captured structured data that could be shared a little bit more widely. Perhaps, these days, for example, all of this email matching stuff was neither done by journalists, neither was it done by academics. It was done by a separate entity that basically merged this information together and made it available that journalists then used.
Yeah, I mean, historically what's happened with that is that the journalists are the ones who can't afford to buy the product of those separate entities, that they don't give it away for free, that they charge quite a bit for it, and that not having it is not worth the price that it's charged to a newsroom. That has traditionally been the case. I don't know that that's going to change. But if you have to make a business off of newsrooms, you're like in trouble.
One
right?
thing that would be valuable, so one of the things that would be valuable, and I don't mean to dialogue and other people should ask questions within this, I'll take this offline, is it would be nice if newsrooms like yours and others, even the smaller ones, start kind of saying is, if these types of technologies were available, if these types of questions were answerable, I know this is competitive edge problem, nobody wants to do this kind of stuff, but it still would be nice to kind of have a list of things that, these kinds of things helped us in this kind of a story, or if we had this, we could do these types of stories.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm working towards in this TAO thing. IRE has been working on that for years. And yeah, that's just, I think that's where we're headed, is to be able to say, these are the kinds of questions where these techniques often help. And these are the kinds of questions where we've tried it and, we haven't found the right use case yet. It might be out there, but we haven't found it. And so that is as we get better at doing this. And that's where I think that as there are at least some of us who lean on, who say, okay, this isn't hard enough not to try. We need more people who will do that. And that it's just too easy to try, even if it doesn't result in anything. We take an awful lot of notes in investigative reporting that never see the light of day, right? 1 out of 30, 40 interviews might make it into publication. 1 out of 10, 15 data sets that we analyze might make it into publication. So we're not averse to doing things that don't pay off immediately. But we have to be able to understand it first, and I think that's where we're headed. I do think there's hope. So.
Hi, thank you for sharing your whole experience. It was very interesting to me as well. So far, I think the experience was about like news productions and the writing news stories. But I want to know more about your thoughts in readerships or like your audience. So I am quite interested in like influence of the news media into the public opinions or how they shape the society. So I mean, that's one of the reasons that I was working a lot with news consumption. And then I guess it is more available, like data itself. So my background is computer science, by the way. So I just wonder, like, whether the news media itself are interested in understanding more about their audience. And there was also this accusation about that news leading audience or audience leading news. So I just wonder what you think and whether there's any effort in
Well, I will
regarding
tell
that.
you that, at least in my newsroom, we are obsessed with understanding our audience to the tune of several $1 million it seems like every other month going into another new department to help understand our readership and our audience better. And I would have to lean on the word bullshit that we heard later if I were to go further than that. So I think I could try to bullshit my way through it, but I don't think I know. But no, we're very interested in audience. And, we have whole audience development departments. We spend an awful lot of time figuring out, for instance, one of the things that I think we've been surprised about in recent years is how our longest form journalism is most successful on mobile. And the reason is what people are doing when they're reading their phones is often they're stuck in traffic, or they shouldn't be reading their phones on traffic, but they are, or stuck at the doctor's office, or stuck at the train. You're somewhere, you're waiting for somebody. When people read their phones, it's when they're really not doing anything else and they have nothing else to do. So we'll find that people get through a 15,000 word story all the way on their phone where they would never get anywhere near it in their desktop. So, yes, we are obsessed with readership, and I just am not in that department, so I don't know anything about it. Sorry.
Thank you.
How much discussion has there been in the newsroom about when machine learning is used? How do you ensure that you're using it in a way that's objective and unbiased? Like, one concern might be is that if you're using machine learning to tell you sort of in which corners to look when you're doing your reporting, it's sort of directing you, so it's sort of like narrowing very much what you're looking at, and you might be missing out in some sort of important aspects of the story.
Yeah, I don't know about newsrooms generally. I can tell you in investigative reporting that comes up frequently, like how do you know that you're not just doing confirmation bias kind of thing? And I guess one of the ways I would answer that is that this is going to sound really flippant, and if somebody tweets it, I'm really going to get upset. So I'm going to say this right away. We don't really care. And I don't mean it as flippantly as I sound. We start an investigative project because we suspect that something is wrong. We've either been told something is wrong, we've observed something is wrong, a system is working the way it's supposed to or it's not. So we have fairly specific questions when we're going in. And I've never had an investigation end up with the same questions that I went in on, so I'm not saying that we just focus on those and we'll never change our minds at all. But we're not trying to describe a data set. We're trying to uncover wrongdoing. And so I don't really mind if what we're doing is only focusing on the parts that are where wrongdoing might be, the way that we have defined wrongdoing. And I think that's one kind of, it is something from outside the trade that I think that people misunderstand a little bit, that we very rarely get a data set and then analyze it for something. We almost always have a question and then either create or obtain some data set that might help us answer a very narrow question. So you're right, we probably aren't looking at it, and that's probably why we are in the danger zone from a pure data science perspective. But that's why I was saying early on that I'm not sure I'm that concerned about it. I'm sure there are people here who would disagree, and I'd invite you to.
You spoke a lot about machine learning and using it for investigative stories, but do you see automation coming in investigative stories in any way? Because a lot of other news organizations use a very basic level of automation for getting stories out and earnings and so forth. But if you're working on a topic, and do you guys have a system to set up an automated thing to just look for certain kinds of keywords or scrape a bunch of websites, and beyond just a basic Google News alert, but something which can work with investigative stories?
Yeah, we've been doing that reasonably well for a while, I think. There are bots out there that we can use to collect information from Twitter or something like it. It happens that there's very little of the material we use comes from what's already public, right? So it's a little less than we think, although that's not always true. For instance, I remember I did one story where we were looking to see, it was very quick, we were looking to see whether or not, I don't know if you remember after Newtown, there was one moment at which the NRA tweeted something about how, if Obama doesn't like guns, we should take away his daughter's Secret Service or something like that. And it seemed that opinion changed about the NRA and about gun control very quickly. Like, that was like a moment. And so, you know, we did collect tweets to see, we did do some analysis on tweets to see if that did change. It didn't really, but it seemed like it had. So yeah, the automatic collection of data has not been too much of a problem where it's available. And as an example, with the HAC, we do this a lot, where something is available state by state. We might automate getting it from every state. But it doesn't work quite as well sometimes as you would think, because everything's different. But on the other side of it, you know, can we have something describe something to us, you know, in an efficient way that we might find interesting? That's good too.
Mine's a somewhat related question. Have you had any trouble with public agencies who might be willing to turn over to you individual records or a small set of records, but when you ask for their entire database about a topic, licensees or enforcements or whatever, resist giving you the whole thing as asking for too much?
Every day.
Yeah. Well, I kind of suspected that was the answer. Any tips or tricks to help get access to entire databases?
Well, I mean, there's, flippantly, we would call it reporting, so, you know, what I'll do when I want to get something like that from an agency is I start out just saying, like, I just want to come over, find out what you do, tell me about yourself, tell me what you do, and like, oh, you know, I have so many questions of this, and then, but I will agree not to make the whole thing public if they'll give it to me. I mean, what you have to figure out is whether or not the person who's saying it knows what they're talking about, and that can be in two ways. They know that what they're talking about in terms of technically whether it's possible, and if they don't know technically, you have to get beyond that. Or then legally, if it's possible, they always have the legal ability to do it, except in a few cases where the legislatures have made particular data sets difficult to get in bulk. Then you have to talk to the policy people into letting you have it. So that's why I was flippantly calling it reporting. It's just, you have to talk with them. Jay, are we done?
There's one more thing we have to do. We need to thank you for a really stellar talk, so